Welcome to a Fireside Reading of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 22, Part 1. Some old scenes and some new people. Steerforth and I stayed for more than a fortnight in that part of the country. We were very much together, I need not say, but occasionally we were asunder for some hours at a time. He was a good sailor, and I was but an indifferent one, and when he went out boating with Mr. Peggotty, which was a favourite amusement of his, I generally remained ashore. My occupation of Peggotty's spare room put a constraint upon me from which he was free, for, knowing how assiduously she attended on Mr. Barkis all day, I did not like to remain out late at night, whereas Steerforth, lying at the inn, had nothing to consult but his own humour. Thus it came about that I heard of his making little treats for the fishermen at Mr. Peggotty's house of call, the Willing Mind, after I was in bed, and of his being afloat, wrapped in fisherman's clothes, whole moonlight nights, and coming back when the morning tide was at flood. By this time, however, I knew that his restless nature and bold spirits delighted to find a vent in rough toil and hard weather, as in any other means of excitement that presented itself freshly to him. So none of his proceedings surprised me. Another cause of our being sometimes apart was that I had naturally an interest in going over to Blunderston and revisiting the old familiar scenes of my childhood, while Steerforth, after being there once, had naturally no great interest in going there again. Hence, on 3 or 4 days that I can at once recall, we went our several ways after an early breakfast and met again at a late dinner. I had no idea how he employed his time in the interval, beyond a general knowledge that he was very popular in the place and had 20 means of actively diverting himself where another man might not have found one. For my own part, my occupation in my solitary pilgrimages was to recall every yard of old road as I went along it, and to haunt the old spots of which I never tired. I haunted them as my memory had often done, and lingered among them as my younger thoughts had lingered when I was far away. The grave beneath the tree where both my parents lay, on which I had looked out when it was my father's only, with such curious feelings of compassion, and by which I had stood so desolate when it was opened to receive my pretty mother and her baby. The grave which Peggotty's own faithful care had ever since kept neat, and made a garden of, I walked near by the hour. It lay a little off the churchyard path in a quiet corner, not so far removed, but I could read the names upon the stone as I walked to and fro, startled by the sound of the church bell when it struck the hour, for it was like a departed voice to me. My reflections at these times were always associated with the figure I was to make in life, and the distinguished things I was to do. My echoing footsteps went to no other tune, but were as constant to that as if I had come home to build my castles in the air at a living mother's side. There were great changes in my home. The ragged nests, so long deserted by the rooks, were gone, and the trees were lopped and topped out of their remembered shapes. The garden had run wild, and half the windows of the house were shut up. It was occupied, but only by a poor lunatic gentleman and the people who took care of him. He was always sitting at my little window, looking out into the churchyard, and I wondered whether his rambling thoughts ever went upon any of the fancies that used to occupy mine on the rosy mornings when I peeped out of that same little window in my night clothes and saw the sheep quietly feeding in the light of the rising sun. Our old neighbours, Mr. and Mrs. Graper, were gone to South America, and the rain had made its way through the roof of their empty house and stained the outer walls. Mr. Chillip was married again to a tall, raw-boned, high-nosed wife, and they had a weazened little baby with a heavy head that it couldn't hold up, and 2 weak staring eyes with which it seemed to be always wondering why it had ever been born. It was with a singular jumble of sadness and pleasure that I used to linger about my native place, until the reddening winter sun admonished me that it was time to start on my returning walk. But when the place was left behind, and especially when Steerforth and I were happily seated over our dinner by a blazing fire, it was delicious to think of having been there. So it was, though in a softened degree, when I went to my neat room at night, and turning over the leaves of the crocodile book, which was always there upon a little table, remembered with a grateful heart how blessed I was in having such a friend as Steerforth, such a friend as Peggotty, and such a substitute for what I had lost as my excellent and generous aunt. My nearest way to Yarmouth in coming back from these long walks was by a ferry. It landed me on the flat between the town and the sea, which I could make straight across and so save myself a considerable circuit by the high road. Mr. Peggotty's house being on that waste place and not 100 yards out of my track, I always looked in as I went by. Steerforth was pretty sure to be there expecting me, and we went on together through the frosty air and gathering fog towards the twinkling lights of the town. One dark evening, when I was later than usual, for I had that day been making my parting visit to Blunderston, as we were now about to return home, I found him alone in Mr. Peggotty's house, sitting thoughtfully before the fire. He was so intent upon his own reflections that he was quite unconscious of my approach. This, indeed, he might easily have been if he had been less absorbed, for footsteps fell noiselessly on the sandy ground outside. But even my entrance failed to rouse him. I was standing close to him, looking at him, and still with a heavy brow he was lost in his meditations. He gave such a start when I put my hand upon his shoulder that he made me start too. "You come upon me," he said almost angrily, "like a reproachful ghost." "I was obliged to announce myself somehow," I replied. "Have I called you down from the stars?" "No," he answered, "no." "Up from anywhere, then?" said I, taking my seat near him. "I was looking at the pictures in the fire," he returned. "But you were spoiling them for me," said I, as he stirred it quickly with a piece of burning wood, striking out of it a train of red-hot sparks that went careering up the little chimney and roaring out into the air. "You would not have seen them," he returned. "I detest this mongrel time, neither day nor night. How late you are! Where have you been?" "I have been taking leave of my usual walk," said I. "And I have been sitting here," said Steerforth, glancing round the room, "thinking that all the people we found so glad on the night of our coming down might, to judge from the present wasted air of the place, be dispersed or dead or come to I don't know what harm. David, I wish to God I'd had a judicious father these last 20 years. "My dear Steerforth, what is the matter?" "I wish with all my soul I had been better guided," he exclaimed. "I wish with all my soul I could guide myself better." There was a passionate dejection in his manner that quite amazed me. He was more unlike himself than I could have supposed possible. "It would have been better to be this poor Peggotty, or his lout of a nephew," he said, getting up and leaning moodily against the chimney-piece with his face towards the fire, "than to be myself 20 times richer and 20 times wiser, and be the torment to myself that I have been in this devil's bark of a boat within the last half-hour." I was so confounded by the alteration in him that at first I could only observe him in silence, as he stood leaning his head upon his hand and looking gloomily down at the fire. At length I begged him, with all the earnestness I felt, to tell me what had occurred to cross him so unusually, and to let me sympathize with him if I could not hope to advise him. Before I had well concluded, he began to laugh, fretfully at first, but soon with returning gaiety. "Tut, it's nothing, Daisy. Nothing," he replied. "I told you at the inn in London I am heavy company for myself sometimes. I have been a nightmare to myself just now. Must have had one, I think. At odd dull times nursery tales come up into the memory unrecognized for what they are. I believe I've been confounding myself with the bad boy who didn't care, and become food for lions, a grander kind of going to the dogs, I suppose. What old women call the horrors have been creeping over me from head to foot. I have been afraid of myself." "You are afraid of nothing else, I think," said I. "Perhaps not, and yet may have enough to be afraid of, too," he answered. "Well, so it goes by. I am not about to be hipped again, David, but I tell you, my good fellow, once more, that it would have been well for me, and for more than me, if I had a steadfast and judicious father." His face was always full of expression, but I never saw it express such a dark kind of earnestness as when he said these words, with his glance bent on the fire. "So much for that," he said, making as if he tossed something light into the air with his hand. "Why, being gone, I am a man again, like Macbeth, and now for dinner, if I have not, Macbeth-like, broken up the feast with most admired disorder, Daisy." "But where are they, I wonder?" said I. "God knows," said Steerforth. "After strolling to the ferry looking for you, I strolled in here and found the place deserted. That set me thinking, and you found me thinking." The advent of Mrs. Gummidge with a basket explained how the house happened to be empty. She had hurried out to buy something that was needed against Mr. Peggotty's return with the tide, and had left the door open in the meanwhile, lest Ham and little Emily, with whom it was an early night, should come home while she was gone. Steerforth, after very much improving Mrs. Gummidge's spirits by a cheerful salutation and a jocose embrace, took my arm and hurried me away. He had improved his own spirits no less than Mrs. Gummidge's, for they were again at their usual flow, and he was full of vivacious conversation as we went along. "And so," he said gaily, "we abandon this buccaneer life tomorrow, do we?" "So we agreed," I returned, "and our places by the coach are taken, you know." "Aye, there's no help for it, I suppose," said Steerforth. "I've almost forgotten that there's anything to do in the world but to go out tossing on the sea here. I wish there was not." "As long as the novelty should last," said I, laughing. "Like enough," he returned, "though there's a sarcastic meaning in that observation for an amiable piece of innocence like my young friend. Well, I dare say I am a capricious fellow, David. I know I am, but while the iron is hot, I can strike it vigorously too. I could pass a reasonably good examination already as pilot in these waters, I think." "Mr. Peggotty says you're a wonder," I returned. A nautical phenomenon, eh? Laughed Steerforth. Indeed he does, and you know how truly. I know how ardent you are in any pursuit you follow, and how easily you can master it. And that amazes me most in you, Steerforth, that you should be contented with such fitful uses of your powers. Contented? He answered merrily. I am never contented, except with your freshness, my gentle Daisy. As to fitfulness, I've never learned the art of binding myself to any of the wheels on which the Ixions of these days are turning round and round. I missed it somehow in a bad apprenticeship, and now don't care about it. You know I have bought a boat down here. What an extraordinary fellow you are, Steerforth, I exclaimed, stopping, for this was the first I had heard of it. When you may never care to come near the place again? I don't know that, he returned. I have taken a fancy to the place, at all events, walking me briskly on. I have bought a boat that was for sale, a clipper, Mr. Peggotty says, and so she is, and Mr. Peggotty will be master of her in my absence. Now I understand you, Steerforth, said I exultingly. You pretend to have bought it for yourself, but you've really done so to confer a benefit on him. I might have known as much at first knowing you. My dear kind Steerforth, how can I tell you what I think of your generosity? Tush, he answered, turning red. The less said the better. Didn't I know, cried I, didn't I say that there was not a joy or sorrow or any emotion of such honest hearts that was indifferent to you? Aye, he answered, you told me all that. There, let it rest. We've said enough. Afraid of offending him by pursuing the subject when he made so light of it, I only pursued it in my thoughts as we went on at even a quicker pace than before. She must be newly rigged, said Steerforth, and I shall leave Littimer behind to see it done, that I may know she's quite complete. Did I tell you that Littimer had come down? No? Oh, yes, came down this morning with a letter from my mother. As our looks met, I observed that he was pale even to his lips, though he looked very steadily at me. I feared that some difference between him and his mother might have led to his being in the frame of mind in which I'd found him at the solitary fireside. I hinted so. Oh, no, he said, shaking his head and giving a slight laugh. Nothing of the sort. Yes, he is come down, that man of mine. The same as ever? Said I. The same as ever, said Steerforth. Distant and quiet as the North Pole. He shall see to the boat being fresh named. She's the Stormy Petrel now. What does Mr. Peggotty care for stormy petrels? I have christened her again. By what name? I asked. The Little Em'ly. As he had continued to look steadily at me, I took it as a reminder that he objected to being extolled for his consideration. I could not help showing in my face how much it pleased me, but I said little, and he resumed his usual smile and seemed relieved. But see here, he said, looking before us, where the original Little Em'ly comes, and that fellow with her, eh? Upon my soul, he's a true knight. He never leaves her. Ham was a boat builder in these days, having improved a natural ingenuity in that handicraft until he'd become a skilled workman. He was in his working dress and looked rugged enough, but manly withal, and a very fit protector for the blooming little creature at his side. Indeed, there was a frankness in his face, an honesty, and an undisguised show of his pride in her and his love for her, which were to me the best of good looks. I thought, as they came towards us, that they were well matched, even in that particular. She withdrew her hand timidly from his arm as we stopped to speak to them, and blushed as she gave it to Steerforth and to me. When they passed on, after we'd exchanged a few words, she did not like to replace that hand, but still appearing timid and constrained, walked by herself. I thought all this very pretty and engaging, and Steerforth seemed to think so too, as we looked after them, fading away in the light of a young moon. Suddenly there passed us, evidently following them, a young woman, whose approach we had not observed, but whose face I saw as she went by, and thought I had a faint remembrance of. She was lightly dressed, looked bold and haggard and flaunting and poor, but seemed for the time to have given all that to the wind which was blowing, and to have nothing in her mind but going after them. As the dark, distant level absorbing their figures into itself left but itself visible between us and the sea and clouds, her figure disappeared in like manner, still no nearer to them than before. "That is a black shadow to be following the girl," said Steerforth, standing still. "What does it mean?" He spoke in a low voice that sounded almost strange to me. "She must have it in her mind to beg of them, I think," said I. "A beggar would be no novelty," said Steerforth, "but it is a strange thing that the beggar should take that shape tonight." "Why?" I asked. "For no better reason, truly, than because I was thinking," he said after a pause, "of something like it when it came by." "Where the devil did it come from, I wonder?" "From the shadow of this wall, I think," said I, as we emerged upon a road on which a wall abutted. "It's gone," he returned, looking over his shoulder, "and all ill go with it. Now for dinner." But he looked again over his shoulder towards the sea line, glimmering afar off, and yet again, and he wondered about it in some broken expressions several times in the short remainder of our walk, and only seemed to forget it when the light of fire and candle shone upon us, seated warm and merry at table. Littimer was there, and had his usual effect upon me. When I said to him that I hoped Mrs. Steerforth and Miss Dartle were well, he answered respectfully, and of course respectably, that they were tolerably well. He thanked me and had sent their compliments. This was all, and yet he seemed to me to say as plainly as a man could say, "You are very young, sir. You are exceedingly young." We had almost finished dinner when, taking a step or two towards the table from the corner where he kept watch upon us, or rather upon me, as I felt, he said to his master, "I beg your pardon, sir. Miss Mowcher is down here." "Who?" cried Steerforth, much astonished. "Miss Mowcher, sir." "Why, what on earth does she do here?" said Steerforth. "It appears to be her native part of the country, sir. She informs me that she makes one of her professional visits here every year, sir. I met her in the street this afternoon, and she wished to know if she might have the honor of waiting on you after dinner, sir." "Do you know the giantess in question, Daisy?" inquired Steerforth. I was obliged to confess I felt ashamed, even at being at this disadvantage before Littimer, that Miss Mowcher and I were wholly unacquainted. "Then you shall know her," said Steerforth, "for she is one of the 7 wonders of the world. When Miss Mowcher comes, show her in." I felt some curiosity and excitement about this lady, especially as Steerforth burst into a fit of laughing when I referred to her, and positively refused to answer any question of which I made her the subject. I remained, therefore, in a state of considerable expectation until the cloth had been removed some half an hour, and we were sitting over our decanter of wine before the fire, when the door opened, and Littimer, with his habitual serenity, quite undisturbed, announced, "Miss Mowcher." I looked at the doorway and saw nothing. Let's find out about Miss Mowcher tomorrow. I hope you enjoy this as much as I do. What a beautiful writer he is. And I will see you all tomorrow at the same time and place, 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram. And in case you have plans, you can always catch it on the YouTube channel Fireside Reading, or if you don't have time, the synopsis that I put up. Please subscribe if you would like to that channel. I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Hope you have a wonderful July the 4th. Until I see you again, please stay very well. Good night.